So what we're going to do to start off this last session is just to get each of our panelists, each of our guest speakers to say a few words by way of brief impressions of the day, and to give some thought to. We're at the point, I think, where we need to think about what are we going to do, and what are the questions, and what are the methods of moving forward on this. I mean, we can have a one-day session, but we don't want it to end there. We want it to lead to change within the system, I guess. And so I'm going to ask the speakers also to reflect upon that a little bit. So we'll go in the order that speakers spoke. So Trudy, right, Susan, and then Jim, and then Michaela. So I'll hand it over to all four of you.
I feel as if I am in the midst of experts here. I have appreciated so much learning from you at both of the table discussions and the posters and the panelists. And I just love the fact that Sandy uses learning outcomes in making decisions, making academic decisions. That is so smart. I have heard and read in your survey about your need to engage more faculty, and I think that that is, as I've gone to campuses for many years, that's the number one question that I get: how do we engage more faculty? And I think we have to have a lot of ways of connecting it to things that faculty value. And you know what those things are. You've said that setting learning outcomes must be linked to assessment, and that's where we, speaking of yourselves, have the most difficulty, and we need to do more. So I think continuing to share among each other the kinds of things that you're doing is the way to go. I've heard it said several times that it takes time to develop these things. You need multiple measures, and yet you can't do all of everything at once. It takes several years to develop all of the ways that you can assess, and so you can get a plan that will put some things this year and some other things next year, and then maybe come back the third year and do some of the things you did in the first year. So have at least a 5-year plan so that you can do multiple things, but do it over time, and don't overwhelm yourselves thinking that it all needs to happen at once. I picked up some interest in electronic portfolios. I think that they can be used in any field. We have about 35 departments on our campus that are using them, and they range from medicine to the arts. And so I encourage you to continue to look at those possibilities. You've said how important resources are for professional development, for administration analysis and reporting on the kinds of studies that you undertake. This is something that I thought about when you talk about resources. Even a small institution may find resources hiding in different places. You have faculty in psychology and political science and sociology who do survey work and interviews and focus groups, and they may have groups of students, courses that they're teaching that would benefit from having practice for their students in doing surveys, interviews, focus groups for the campus or for a department that wants to get that done. And so look for the experts on your own campus, and please consider student affairs professionals, because that is it takes all of us to do the job on our campuses, and they can help us with assessment. So if that's one new idea I would leave with you, because I haven't heard very much about that today. but do reach out to your student affairs, student support colleagues and get some help. And finally, the question that was asked earlier about co-curricular assessment. There's a big Lumina-funded project right now in the States to develop the transcript in such a way that it gets at student learning outcomes in a variety of areas, including those that would be developed in out-of-class activities. So stay tuned for that.
Trudy said everything I was going to say, so I'm done. I also want to add my thanks to all of you for letting me be here. This was great to hear where Ontario is, so I'm going to second Paul Gooch's comments. Please come to the conference in Ontario. You will be among similar kindred spirits, and I think we all have a lot to learn from each other, because while we have some things figured out, we're all still muddling around trying to move our way forward. I really appreciate what Trudy said about it's a process and give yourself time, be kind to yourself. I think this is also, I'm going to make a couple of comments about some things that, some themes that came out for me, and also make a couple of maybe pointed remarks or challenges to your Quality Council here in Alberta. And I think in terms of this, coming up with plans for assessment, quality councils need to listen to where institutions are in Alberta right now, that you have a lot of really engaged people here today who are thinking about it, who are trying to figure out how to do it in, as we say at my institution, in this resource-constrained environment, and what are the best ways forward. And so the Quality Council has a role in doing things like today, bringing people together, but also in terms of the assessment of new programs and the audits of cyclical program reviews, really keeping that in mind in terms of that it is a process. One of my comments is about the assessment and how to do it. It's not rocket science. I know when I first started in this, I thought it had to be something more complicated than what it really was. Was it really that simple? Was it really as simple as starting with making sure a program has a capstone course or experience, or a suite of things that students are doing at the end of their program that allows you to not only assess what the students are doing, but then you can build in how can we use this, what we're already doing, as a way to reflect over 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years how the program is doing, how students overall in the program is doing. So I would, some of the conversation at my table and what I heard in the comments is around what are the ways to figure this out? And in some ways it's to just start with what you have, start with really good assessments, and it's just assessing courses is an assessment of a program, but that's a good place to start, and you can build out from there. A second point is around, at least my experience with the Ontario Quality Council, and what we're looking for when a new program proposal is coming through. And I'm on the Quality Appraisal Committee, where we have to review the proposals for all of the new undergraduate and graduate programs. And we ask them how they're going to assess how a student is learning, and then we ask for their plan. What's your plan for documenting? And this relates to my comment I just made about, Quality Council, please don't ask people to have full blown out, details of every single thing that they're going to do in this survey and that survey. What we're looking for in the Ontario context, and it's not pages and pages, it's often a short, thoughtful paragraph about what makes sense for this program. Not what makes sense for the institution, not what makes sense for the provincial sector, but what makes sense for this program. Is there a placement internship that's happening, and are we going to build in some ways where we're going back to the employers who've employed our students, where we're building in these assessments that, again, over time, over a couple of years, we can start to look at. A third point for me is one that has been a theme of my whole career as an academic administrator, as well as with the Quality Council, and it's how do we engage faculty? I was really pleased to see, like others here, that we have really fabulous students who are here who are actively participating and asking questions. What I learned in my divisions is students often are the way to open the eyes to faculty that they actually really need to change their programs. We encouraged faculty when they were doing program reviews, whether they had 5,000 enrollment in their program or whether they had 50, to do some focus groups with their students, to talk to their students prior to writing their self-study that they had to do. And what I saw just on the ground floor was the initial conversation I had with a chair and associate chairs about, how do you think your curriculum's doing? Is it aligned with your learning outcomes? Oh yeah, everything's fine. Then they would go and talk to their students, and what would come back in terms of their self-study was, oh my gosh, our students are telling us that this series of courses that we thought were really great, that this certain thing isn't happening. Or when we then took what the students were saying and we started to look more closely at course evaluations, at certain kinds of assessments, at what was being taught, what books were being assigned, and we realized we needed to do some work. So your students really are your partners. They're your best source of, eyes that are there that can tell you what's happening from their perspective. Now, of course, there's also the faculty. This is what we think students need to learn, and we need to have that balance. But I strongly encourage you, for those of you in institutional roles, encourage your programs to actually talk to their students. I am not an institution where I can make it as a requirement. I can make it as a, I'll be nicer to you if you do this. It's really highly recommended. Reviewers like to see that you've talked to your students, areas. But you can get great information. And finally, this is for the Quality Council, and this is my challenge to you. I think it's for you to embrace your role as a motivator for change, but embrace your role as a way to improve the system and help institutions. Some of my proudest moments of being on the Quality Appraisal Committee now for 5 years is not the really fabulous programs that we approved, but some of the institutions, and I would say these were smaller institutions that had less well-developed teaching and learning centers. Maybe this is the first time they've had a new program in a number of years, or they were starting their first graduate program. We took a view of, there were some program proposals that came in where if we were taking a substantive view, we could have said, you failed, we're not going to approve this. But we played the long game. And sometimes it meant the executive director going back and talking with the provost and saying, look, why don't you withdraw this program? Why don't you take seriously the feedback from the Quality Council and the Quality Appraisal Committee? Go back and rethink. You don't really have the right faculty. One example, you want to have an anthropology program, but all you have are sociology faculty, and you're going to hire some anthropology faculty after the program is approved. Maybe you need to rethink that and figure out how you're going to have the right people in place. I would say that there's a couple of institutions and a couple of programs that I'm really proud to say, are now approved, admitting students, and are incredibly high quality programs because we worked with those institutions. It took courage, somebody used the word courage, on the part of those institutions to not just get their back up and go and whine and complain about the Quality Council, but to take our feedback seriously. And it took us saying we want to play this formative role because what we're really concerned about is not simply being a gatekeeper, but saying we're all in this together and helping institutions approve. And finally, just a big shout out for all those curriculum developers who are up here speaking, who are in your institutions. I agree, we need to support them. They do a lot of really good work. They take a lot of flack. I have learned a lot. Especially starting with going to symposiums like these. I have learned a lot from curriculum developers, and just like students, they are your friends. Thank you.
Well, Trudy and Sandy said everything I was going to say, but I'll say things in a little different way. In my reflections on the day, I've jotted down a number of words that start with the letter C. Collaboration, cooperation, and coordination. Seems to me outcomes assessment is highly relational work, and a lot of times that does require facilitation and expertise from areas like the Teaching Learning Center. But collaboration and coordination happens not just at the local level, but can happen at the advanced ed sector level. And I think today's event is a real good demonstration of that. We've got the institutions here, the ministry, ACAT, CAQC, all attempting to move us in a common direction. The word courage has been mentioned a few times today. Courage to lead, courage to facilitate, courage to sometimes hold the line, as you were just referencing, Sandy. Conversation, the importance of carving out time and space at our institutions for these really important conversations about teaching, learning, the types of outcomes that we're wanting to cultivate in our academic programs. Culture and context are critical considerations, I think, in moving this work forward. Our institutions have very different cultures. Our disciplines have very different cultures. Our programs have different cultures, and we need to tailor our approaches, I think, to suit those different cultures and contexts. A couple of other quick thoughts. I was reminded today, in addition to the supports and incentives and recognition and rewards that are important in moving this work forward, I was reminded of some of the levers that we have at our disposal to help move this work ahead. Things like course and program approval policies, periodic program review policies, the Quality Council itself. And I don't mean in a punitive way, but rather in a helpful and supportive and generative way, the way that Sandy was just describing, actually. Final thought, it occurred to me that at one level, this is really complex and messy and time and labor intensive, effort intensive work. But at another level, and it was really Trudy's 6-column model for outcomes and assessment, I was reminded by that model of really the simplicity and elegance of what this work looks like at its essence. It doesn't have to be rocket science. We have the tools at our disposal to do this work and to do it well. So, thank you.
So first of all, I'd just like to say thank you so much for this opportunity. I do appreciate getting the chance to kind of be the voice for my student association, my students, and the students here today. And I guess in that way, I do kind of have a kind of special perception on this kind of whole forum and just learning outcomes in general. I'm not even 20 yet, so when I was in high school, learning outcomes were already a fully integrated thing in the high school system. But to kind of speak to a point that someone had mentioned earlier, we assume that because they're fully integrated or because they've become so common that we're all speaking the same language. And our teachers would explain to us what our learning outcomes for the year were, but if you asked us at the end of the year, we couldn't tell you what the skills we learned were and how they related to the learning outcomes. And that's coming from someone who was fully integrated into that system from the get-go. And we've spoken actually a lot about learning outcomes today and also assessments. And I find that learning outcomes in and of themselves are a lot harder to pin down than assessments of them. Assessments in an education scope come a lot easier to us. It's more natural. And with learning outcomes, the kind of feeling I've understood is it is The first step is changing possibly the entire culture or the philosophy of the institution in which you're trying to institute them. And that's a huge step. And so that's, I think, why the assessments of them do come a lot easier to us. And if I can offer one word of caution with the assessments, when talking about things like competencies and assessing competencies, we spoke at table 2 about how the system could go mastery, intermediate, and beginner. And while I do agree that that is a good scale, I would like to warn that if you are too stringent in that scale and what those parameters of that scale means, you risk blocking accessibility to students who may not necessarily have the capacity to articulate within those parameters their mastery or their intermediate skills of those competencies. It doesn't mean they can't do it. It just means they can't do it in X, Y, and Z form. And also, I absolutely loved all the presentations today, but I did feel, coming from Polytechnic, there was a lot of focus on the university side. We did have a presentation from Nate and Sate, and that was a really eye-opening experience for me. But coming as a Polytechnic student, you feel there's a lot less options for transfers. You feel like because you're a Polytechnic, you don't have as many accredited courses, so transferability is pretty limited. And that's something that, even if it's just explaining it better, that's something that I would like to hear more about as a Polytechnic student. That's where my interests lie. As well as one suggestion from my student body is a time requirement on transferability agreements. So if you're rewriting one, there needs to be a minimum time agreement. We had a student who, her curriculum was rewritten 2 years ago, so the transfer agreement was rendered null. She didn't know this, so by the time she was a graduate from being a first year, she couldn't transfer to U of C for her geomatics. So she now has to take another whole year of courses at U of C in the general in order to kind of transfer and ensure that those credits kind of match up. And thank you for listening to me babble.
Do you have questions for the panel? They may want to interact with each other too, but I think we'd like to start with any questions that you might have from the floor. I have one to get you started that has come to me on several occasions. Does a learning outcome have to be measurable to be a learning outcome? And if it isn't, do we have to call it something else? Do we have to call it an aim?
It is our hope to be able to measure learning outcomes. But because we can't do it today doesn't mean that we can't develop a way to do it tomorrow. So we always have that as our hope.
Anybody else?
We were having this very conversation at table 11 a little while ago, especially concerning some of the, I guess, higher order capacities coming out of a humanities program, for example. What does assessment of those types of learning outcomes look like? And it may have to be look very different than the assessment of an outcome in a mathematics program or something like that. But that's not to say it's not doable. It just takes some time to think through what it might actually look like.
Questions? Yes, over here. And please identify yourself if you would.
Craig Monk is still McEwen ACAP, unless you've heard something. I thought this was a tremendously positive day, and I think that's a great thing, talking about learning outcomes in the context of assuring quality and reaching out to the community beyond our institutions, and of course the importance to students. I'd like to burnish my reputation as the angel of death a little bit. Some of us in this room are familiar with the Dickinson model for program prioritization. and various ways to decide whether or not things should be prioritized within the institution, especially during austere times. I wonder if anybody on the panel thinks that there's a role for program level outcomes as part of perhaps a competing model for how to cut things. Once you start talking about whether or not you should keep doing things that can't articulate its outcomes, or keep doing things where we're not able to demonstrate that we're able to meet the standards that we profess. Once you start having that conversation, whether or not you alienate all of your faculty allies that you're trying to engage in this.
Fortunately, I'm at an institution where we never had to prioritize our priorities in one of those programs that they've done. I will say, though, where we're at in terms of U of T and the Ontario context, that are with the cyclical reviews that happen and with the external reviewers, and the fact that what we are asking them to do in terms of an assessment of quality is to say, are the program learning outcomes aligned with the curriculum that's here? Are they aligned with the admissions requirements? Are they aligned with all of these types of things? And those external reviewer reports do go through governance. They go to one of the subcommittees of, we don't have a Senate at U of T, we're a unicameral system, not a bicameral system. So we have a committee, though, Academic Policy and Programs, that reviews all of these external review reports. And there are times where at that committee, the assessment there is not necessarily, though they have the ability to say, we are going to suspend a program, or say if you don't do some things, we're going to ask the division to look at closing it. But there are requirements sometimes that a program reports back, that if external reviewers have said, and there have been some cases, there's some real issues in terms of the curriculum. And again, learning outcomes are, you could say they're the stick or the tool. For me, they're the framework in which we're asking our reviewers to make an assessment, that they are used in that way. They can be used at from my institution at a divisional level we have used them to make decisions around closing down programs. It's when we did this undergraduate program review, and there's this one report that says we had a dizzying array of overlapping undergraduate programs. And when we started to look at not just what courses they were offering, but what were the learning outcomes? What were students supposed to be learning by the end of this program? It made sense for us to close down what were a series of small enrollment programs that simply were doing the same thing. To me, that's a healthier way, because I guess I have become a true believer. I am from sociology, the neoliberal corporatization of the university department, and I deal with those comments in my job, but you need to let faculty talk aside. You need to let faculty express that, because let's talk about it and then let's move on. But I have found that learning outcomes, and once you get that out of someone's system, you can use it as that's the entryway for that academic discussion, about does this program really make sense? So yeah, I think it can be, and it's not it's a less systematic, we're looking at the whole institution and we're going to close down this whole wing of the university, but it is a way for you to figure out what do you want to change, what do you want to bring in that's new. And importantly, I've been glad to see that we have actually closed programs, not a whole lot, but we've actually closed programs in the last 5 years that I don't think we would have done without this framework.
Yes, Neil?
Hi, Neil Besner, CAQC, but I'm actually an interloper from Manitoba. Just to say thank you very much for the day. It was terrifically useful. One comment, one question, posing as a comment. The people who engage students day in, day out are faculty members. They're instructors, whatever you want to call them at whatever institution you happen to be in. And although there are people in the room who are part-time faculty members, as it were, administrators who teach a course or two, what I missed from the conversation today was there were lots of students, which was great, lots of administrators coordinators of learning centers and so on, but there weren't very many rank and file faculty members who in fact deal with learning outcomes and engaging with students and their needs every day. And I would just ask that some attempt be made to include some faculty members in the next forum like this. Terrific forum, terrific occasion, but I think we're missing one piece of the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Very helpful comment, Neil. Yes, Art.
This is probably a Trudy question, and it leads from the material you presented on general education testing. And you mentioned sort of the one-off testing and ranking potential and that kind of thing. What about the pre-post of freshman to senior year attribution of general education? Is there any data that is supportive of that kind of assessment?
It's called value added, and it is not reliable. I cited the study from Jeff Steedle with the Council on Aid to Education, who said that it doesn't have the sufficient reliability for making high-stakes decisions. There has, within the last 5 or 6 years, been a series of funded studies of value added. And the Gates Foundation, for instance, brought together a group of people and said, we want everyone to write a paper, and then we'll come together and discuss the papers. And the bottom line conclusion was that there is not enough reliability in the value added calculation to do that pre and post and rely on it for any high stakes decision.
Other questions, comments, suggestions for a next step for the system in Alberta? If none, I'd like you to join me in thanking once again the panelists and Michaela for joining the panel at the end of the day with a very important student voice. And we'll move on to our final closing session. So thank you.